Thanks for joining us for this ISE 2025 panel discussion. We're here to talk about converged networks. First question, gents. First to you, maybe Glenn. If so, are we seeing more converged networks out there, do you think?
Yes, in short, it's becoming it's a big talking point. Convergence has been ongoing for a number of years now, and I think we're at the point now where we are converged. I think it's quite important to note that, there's different types of converged networks. It's very unusual to see all of the AV, all of the services go on, the single switch fabric. I think a common topology, something that I'm seeing a lot of now, is you'd actually see three different types of networks. There'll be, a production network, a BMS network, and an IoT network. And I think if we're talking converged, AV would really sit in that IoT bracket. There's the benefits there, talking to the other sensors and all that good stuff. In short, yes, it's very prevalent.
Mike, what about you? You seeing more? Or the same as kind of previous years?
There's still an aspiration to be converged. Everyone says we wanted to be converged, but then once you start talking to people, as Glenn says, there's different approaches to that and different routes. We've worked on projects where everything's been completely converged, including the BMS. There's obviously challenges with that deployment, as well as managing things post-deployment as well. But we've also seen things completely separate, and sometimes those decisions have evolved and changed throughout the life cycle of that project. So whilst it was originally going to be completely converged with AV sitting on the IT side, suddenly it's not anymore.
And we've seen that
change mid-project. And sometimes that's because different stakeholders come in, or we realise there's a barrier to trying to do things in a certain way, and we have to sort of move things on the fly a little bit.
Because obviously you're both from consultants, where do you think this has been driven from primarily? Is it from the client end? Is it the consultant end? Did the integrators have a say? Who has kind of more say? I'm guessing the client. And then if it is the client, is that maybe driven by global policy somewhere else potentially?
It's our job as consultants to help guide and recommend. So the first question the client says is, what should we do? They don't, some clients will say this is what we're doing, but if they rarely do that, otherwise they wouldn't be appointing us in the first place.
So you've got a pretty powerful say then.
Well, in a way, it's more of a conversation, and again, we have to recommend what's the best approach, and that does vary depending on the client, the nature of their organisation, and their appetite for risk as well, because sometimes if they're changing the way they do things, that's going to require some change management, introducing new processes, and even some security policies that may not already be on their networks to start with. So it requires some ongoing discussion, and it's never straightforward.
Glenn, is it never straightforward?
It's never straightforward. To Mike's point, it's for us to really define what converged networks means for the client. A lot of the time we begin talking about it, and it's all well and good, but then when we get into the implementation stages and you begin to understand the amount of bandwidth, the amount of port usage, which has a huge increased cost on the client's infrastructure, we have had instances where the approach has changed mid-project once there's been a realization of quite what is entailed, because the client becomes intrinsically involved in the deployment phase of the project, and that could be an issue.
And does that differ, the bigger the organisation, does that kind of, the likelihood that decision is being made by somewhere, 1,000 miles away, that I guess that kind of muddies the waters as well, is that fair to say?
I would say so, yeah. There's, if you're dealing with a tech client that's really geared up for this sort of deployment, then they're the kind of people that are going to be really enthusiastic and want to be hands-on with that. On the flip side, you could be working with somebody in professional services, legal, who outsource their IT. And in those instances, you're not going to have the right level of engagement with the right people until very late on in the project. And those are the types of projects and customers that, converge maybe isn't the right approach.
Yeah. Where do you guys both stand on, are you kind of pro-converged networks? Are you kind of on the fence? Or is it very much a sort of case-by-case basis you might?
I think, in terms of all the benefits you get from a converged network when it's done right, I think it is the right approach, but you have to be mindful, as Glenn says, of the risks of doing that, of who's involved. Getting that IT department involved at an early stage is absolutely key, and if they're contractors or if they're another side of the world, they're not involved at the right time of the project, you might have a decision made by someone who thinks it's a great idea without understanding the technical challenges of it. Then the IT department steps in and says, absolutely not, that's not going anywhere in network. But no, I think generally speaking, there are huge benefits of doing it, just like Everything else, you've got to manage those expectations a bit, in the same way that you don't want all of your end user devices touching all your BMS necessarily, giving that level of integration. So it's about, I don't know, guiding people through that and making them understand why they should do it in the first place or why they shouldn't.
Yeah. Glenn, how did you feel about that?
I think maybe the single biggest drawback to a converged network is the inability to bench test and benchmark a system before you get to site. It's very important for all of us to do our factory testing and understand the snags with the systems before you get there, but you can't replicate a client's network off site. So we can do all the pre-staging. You can think you got all the routing right, and then when you get to site and realize you've got issues, it become really troublesome to fix.
So it becomes a very different affair once you're actually on site on the network.
Yeah, and I think if we're taking the non-converged approach, it's a lot easier to look at the whole AV system as a turnkey solution, because there's one throat to choke, as we like to say. It's all in the AV integrators sort of realm to commission that switch from day dot, procuring the equipment, commissioning it, installing it. I'd say I've had projects recently where we're working with financial clients, and they really don't want their AV data on the network, and they're quite happy to have those systems on separate switches. The only items that really need to connect to the network are those with internet connectivity, conferencing, room booking systems, and the like.
Sure. Mike, do the nature of different businesses behave differently to this question? Like if you were dealing with a magazine perhaps, or higher education, would they deal differently to a corporate or a pharmaceutical or a financial even?
Absolutely. I think it makes a huge difference about how critical it is for their network to be as robust and reliable as anything. A financial institution relying on microsecond data for trades and things, that there can't be any disruption to that. So if there's any risk of AV getting in the middle of it and being prioritized, or causing things to go down, then they're not going to want anything because that's going to cost them a lot of money if something goes wrong. Whereas someone else that's not critical, they're mainly looking at email traffic, maybe video calling. If an email gets delayed by a second because some video traffic's prioritized, that's probably not a problem. So it absolutely varies. And again, it depends on how important they view that implementation. You need that buy-in from the senior stakeholders. You can't, as Glenn says, completely replicate a network, but you can do a good job. We've worked on projects where we've staged the entire network off-site and built it at the AV integrator's premises. Now that was unusual, but it got rid of a lot of pain, because we were able to do as much. That wasn't just like reconfiguring some dummy switches. That was using the actual network, configuring it, building it, testing it, because it was more than just the AV that was needing to be tested in advance, because they were moving from a previous network design to a fresh one for this project. So it had other benefits as well. But it wasn't live until they connected it into their actual building. And that's when there are still challenges and problems that you need to overcome.
Glenn, what about you? Does the nature of what the client does dictate how they might behave on the network?
I think so, yeah. Like I was saying, if the company's IT department is geared up for it, they're interested, they've got an active network team that can really get their head around it, they work with IGMP, multicasting, then you're far more likely to recommend it, or to be honest, they will dictate that to you. On the flip side, when you've got a customer that doesn't have that large in-house team, they'll be looking to us for guidance. Yeah. And in those instances, it can be we need to make our recommendations based on best practice. And I've found those instances to be, it's a lot easier for those clients to take it off the network.
Sure. Final question, gents. As AV-IT convergence has happened over the last 10, 15 years, AV devices are now controlled on an IP network. Is the moving to one kind of converged network really the end result of all this AV-IT convergence, Mike?
I think we'll probably get there eventually. I don't think it's any time soon. There needs to be a lot more standards in place. Most end user compute devices and other network connected solutions within any typical organization, other than AV, work on fairly standard protocols. AV's all over the place still. You've got people trying to standardize, but it's still divergent in many cases. So until I think that starts to become more standard, that's going to be a continued barrier to full adoption.
Sure. Glenn, is this the end result of AV-IT convergence?
It's a moving target.
Yeah.
I think, but as Mike said, there's still a lot of proprietary technologies out there. The ideal vision is, I guess, one standard protocol, full interoperability. But bringing that amount of bandwidth onto the client network is not something that you can do unconsidered. So, different approaches for different clients.
Sure. Fantastic. What's left for me to thank Mike and Glenn. Thank you for your time, gents, and thank you too for watching. Goodbye.